The morning was bright and clean. Golden light poured over a mansion so big it looked like a castle from a fairy tale. Cars filled the driveway. White flowers covered every wall. Today was the wedding of Julian Cross, one of the richest men in the country, and everyone said it would be the wedding of the year. But right now, in this exact moment, nobody was smiling. A woman ran down the long marble hallway of the mansion, her shoes slapping hard against the floor. Her name was Grace. She was the maid. She had worked in this house for 3 years, cleaning rooms, folding towels, staying quiet in corners while rich people talked about things that never mattered to her. But today, she was not quiet. Today, she was screaming. Stop the wedding. Somebody stop the wedding. 2 guards grabbed her arms. She fought them, kicking, twisting, her voice cracking as she screamed toward the big church doors just ahead of her. She's not who she says she is. Julian, please, you have to hear me. Inside the church, 500 guests turned their heads. The organ music stopped. Julian Cross stood at the altar in a black tuxedo, his hands frozen at his sides, his heart suddenly pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His bride stood across from him in a white dress that cost more than most people's houses. Her name was Vivian. She was beautiful. She was calm. Too calm. The guards dragged Grace through the doors. Her eyes locked onto Julian's. Ask her about the necklace, Grace shouted. Ask her about her real name. And then the guards pulled her out, and the heavy doors slammed shut, and the room went silent except for the sound of 500 people breathing at once. Julian stood there, frozen, staring at the woman he was seconds away from marrying. And that, my friend, is exactly where our story begins. Before we go any further, if you love a good slow burn, a story full of secrets, betrayal, and a love that fights to survive, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this with someone who needs a good cry today, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps this story reach more people. And trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to the beginning so you understand exactly how we got here. 6 months earlier, Julian Cross was a man who had everything except peace. He owned buildings that touched the clouds. He owned companies in 17 countries. He had a private jet, a private island, and a bank account so full of zeros that even his accountants sometimes lost count. But at night, in his giant empty house, he was alone. His parents had died when he was 22 in a car accident on a rainy mountain road, and he had built his empire out of grief, out of anger, out of need to prove that their son had turned out to be somebody. He worked 18-hour days. He trusted almost no one. He had learned a long time ago that people did not love Julian Cross. They loved his money. And so he built walls around his heart so thick that even he sometimes forgot there was a heart in there at all. That was when Grace came into his life, though not the way you might think. Grace was 29 years old. She had grown up poor, in a small town where the biggest dream anyone had was simply having enough food for winter. Her mother had raised her alone after her father left, working 2 jobs, coming home with tired eyes and empty hands, but somehow always finding a way to smile at her daughter. Grace had learned early that money did not make people good or bad. Kindness did. When her mother got sick, Grace needed a job that paid well and paid fast. A woman from an agency told her about a position in the Cross household. Housekeeping. Simple work. Good pay. Grace took it without hesitation, packed 1 suitcase, and moved into the staff quarters of the biggest house she had ever seen in her life. The first time she saw Julian Cross, he was standing in his enormous kitchen at 2 in the morning, not eating, not drinking, just standing there in the dark, staring out the window like a man who had forgotten how to sleep. She almost didn't say anything. Staff were told never to speak to Mr. Cross unless spoken to first. But something in her chest ached looking at him. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. He turned, surprised that anyone dared to speak to him so plainly. "I don't remember the last time I could," he answered. She didn't know what came over her, but she walked to the stove, and in 15 minutes, she made him a cup of warm milk with a little honey and cinnamon, the same drink her mother used to make her on nights when the world felt too heavy. "My mom used to say this fixes everything," Grace said, setting the cup down in front of him. "It probably won't fix your empire, but it might help you sleep." Julian stared at the cup like it was the strangest, most unexpected gift anyone had ever given him. He took a sip, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he said softly. "Just doing my job," Grace answered, and walked away before he could see her blush. But it wasn't just her job. Not really. Over the weeks that followed, small moments like that kept happening. She would leave a book on his desk that she thought he might like. He would notice and read it, and leave a note in the margin for her to find. She would hum while she watered the plants in the garden, and sometimes, without meaning to, he would find himself standing at the window just to listen. Neither of them said anything about it. Neither of them were supposed to. He was her employer. She was his maid. There were lines that were not meant to be crossed. But hearts, as you know, don't always care about lines. Then one afternoon in early spring, everything changed. Julian walked into his office and announced to his assistant that he was engaged. Her name was Vivian Marsh. She had appeared in his life only 2 months earlier at a charity gala, wearing a red dress that turned every head in the room. She was elegant. She was clever. She said all the right things at all the right times. She laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. She asked about his day, even when she clearly didn't care about the answer. And Julian, who had spent his whole life being lonely at the top, mistook her attention for love. Within 2 months, he had proposed. The whole staff was shocked at the speed of it. Grace felt something twist painfully in her chest when she heard the news, though she told herself it was foolish to feel anything at all. She was the maid. He was a billionaire. Of course, he was going to marry someone beautiful and powerful and perfect, someone like Vivian, not someone like her. But something about Vivian never sat right with Grace. Little things. The way Vivian's smile disappeared the second Julian looked away. The way she spoke to the staff like they were furniture, snapping her fingers, never once saying please or thank you. The way she always seemed to be checking her phone, stepping into other rooms to whisper on calls that ended the second anyone walked in. Grace told herself it wasn't her business. She kept her head down. She did her job. But one night, while cleaning Vivian's private suite, she found something that changed everything. It was hidden in the bottom of a jewelry box, wrapped in a cloth, tucked beneath a false bottom that Grace only found by accident when a drawer got stuck. A photograph. Old, worn at the edges. A photograph of a much younger Vivian, standing next to a man Grace didn't recognize, in front of a run-down apartment building, both of them smiling like they didn't have a single dollar between them. On the back, in pencil, someone had written a name. Not Vivian, a completely different name. Grace's hands were shaking as she stared at it. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she knew, deep in her bones, the way you know when a storm is coming even before the clouds arrive, that something was very, very wrong. She almost told Julian right then. She almost ran to his office with the photograph in her hand. But she stopped herself. What if she was wrong? What if it was nothing? Old boyfriend, old life, everybody has a past. She didn't want to be the maid who destroyed a billionaire's happiness over a hunch. So she put the photograph back exactly where she found it, and she decided to watch, to wait, to learn the truth before she said a single word. That decision would take her on a journey more dangerous than she ever expected. Over the following weeks, Grace began paying closer attention. She noticed Vivian sometimes left the house late at night, telling the staff she was going to a spa or a friend's house, but always coming back with the same tired, tense look on her face, like someone who had just finished a difficult meeting rather than a relaxing massage. She noticed that Vivian never let anyone touch her phone, not even for a second, and that she always turned the screen away from people when a message came in. And she noticed one more thing. A man. He came to the house exactly twice, always claiming to be a wedding planner named Mr. Davies, always meeting with Vivian alone in the garden gazebo, always leaving before Julian came home from work. Grace watched from the kitchen window one evening as the two of them argued quietly, hands moving sharply through the air. Vivian's face twisted into something cold and furious that Grace had never seen her wear in front of Julian. Grace didn't recognize his face at first, but something about him felt familiar, like a shadow at the edge of a memory. It wasn't until she saw him a second time, walking briskly to his car, that it clicked into place. He was the man from the photograph. Older now, but it was him. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her chest. She had to tell someone. But who? If she went to Julian directly, Vivian could deny everything, twist the story, and Julian, blinded by whatever spell this woman had cast on him, might believe his fiancée over his maid. Worse, Grace could lose her job, lose the income her sick mother desperately needed, all over a suspicion she couldn't fully prove yet. So Grace did something she never thought she would do. She decided to investigate. At night, after her shifts ended, she began quietly searching. She found an old newspaper archive at the local library and spent hours scrolling through microfilm, searching for the name written on the back of that photograph. And what she found made her blood run cold. The woman in the photo, the woman with a different name, had a history. 3 years earlier, in a smaller city 2 states away, a wealthy widower named Thomas Reyes had died suddenly just 4 months after marrying a woman who then inherited his entire fortune. The woman had disappeared shortly after, moving out of state, changing her name, vanishing before any investigation could get very far. The police report called it inconclusive. The family called it murder. Nobody could ever prove it. The photo in the newspaper article was blurry, taken from a distance at the funeral. But Grace would know that face anywhere now. It was Vivian. Grace sat there in the library, alone, at almost midnight, her hands trembling around the printed pages, and she realized with horror exactly what was happening. Vivian wasn't marrying Julian because she loved him. She was marrying him because his fortune was even bigger than the last man's. And if history was about to repeat itself, then Julian Cross, the man who had quietly become the most important person in Grace's world, might be in far more danger than he could ever imagine. She had to tell him. Tonight. She couldn't wait another day. She rushed back to the mansion, her heart racing, rehearsing the words in her head over and over. She found Julian in his study, working late, as always, his tie loosened, his eyes tired. "Mr. Cross," she said, and something in her voice made him look up immediately. "I need to talk to you. It's important." He set down his pen. "Grace, what's wrong?" But before she could say another word, the study door opened, and Vivian walked in, smiling that perfect smile, wrapping her arm gently around Julian's shoulder. "There you are, darling," she said sweetly, and then her eyes slid over to Grace, cold and sharp beneath the softness. "Is there a problem?" Grace felt the words freeze in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to speak anyway, to say it right there in front of both of them, but a small, terrified part of her whispered that if she was wrong, if she said this in front of Vivian and it wasn't enough proof, she would destroy her own life and maybe destroy Julian's trust in her forever. "No," Grace said quietly. "No problem. I'm sorry to interrupt." She turned and walked out, her heart pounding, hating herself for her own cowardice, promising herself she would find real, undeniable proof before she tried again. She had no idea that Vivian had seen the fear in her eyes. And people like Vivian did not forgive fear. They used it. The very next morning, Grace was called into the head housekeeper's office and told, without warning, without explanation, that her services were no longer needed. Someone had reported that money was missing from the household accounts, and all evidence pointed to Grace. She was given 1 hour to pack her things and leave the property. Grace knew immediately what had happened. Vivian had framed her, but there was nothing she could do. No proof, no power, just a small suitcase and a heart full of fear for a man who didn't even know he needed saving. She left the mansion that afternoon with tears streaming down her face, glancing back one last time at the enormous house that had, in some strange way, started to feel like home. She thought about her mother, still sick, still needing help. She thought about Julian, walking straight toward a marriage that could cost him everything, maybe even his life. And she thought about how powerless she was to stop any of it. But Grace was not a woman who gave up easily. Her mother had taught her that. So instead of disappearing quietly, she made a decision that would change everything. She wanted to see the one person who might actually believe her. Detective Marcus Bell, a retired police officer who now worked private investigations, someone Grace's mother had once known years ago through church. She showed him the newspaper article, the photograph she had secretly photographed with her phone before leaving the mansion, everything she had found. At first, he was skeptical. It wouldn't be the first time a fired employee tried to get revenge with wild accusations. But Detective Bell was thorough, and when he ran the name from the photograph through his old contacts, what he found confirmed every fear Grace had. The woman known as Vivian Marsh had used at least 3 different names in the past decade. She had married 2 wealthy men, both of whom died under circumstances that were never fully explained. And most disturbing of all, she had a partner. A man who helped her identify targets, forge documents, and disappear after each job was done. The wedding planner. Mr. Davies. He wasn't a wedding planner at all. Grace felt sick. Julian was not just marrying a liar. He was marrying someone who may have killed before and could kill again, and the wedding was now only 3 weeks away. Detective Bell warned Grace that they needed real, solid evidence before going to the police, something concrete enough to hold up, because so far everything was circumstantial. And there was no time to build a slow, careful case. So Grace made a dangerous choice. She decided to go back. Not to the mansion, not directly, but close enough to keep watching. She got a job at a small coffee shop near the Cross Corporate building, where she knew Julian often stopped in the mornings. She told herself it was only to watch, only to gather proof, nothing more. But the truth she barely admitted even to herself, was that some small, stubborn part of her heart simply could not stay away from him. 2 weeks passed. Grace watched Julian from a distance every single morning, her heart aching every time she saw the tired, distracted look on his face, knowing the wedding was getting closer and closer, and he had no idea what was waiting for him at the end of that aisle. Then, one rainy morning, let's say one cold, gray morning, the kind where the wind bites at your coat, but the sky refuses to cry, Julian walked into the coffee shop, and their eyes met across the room. He froze. Grace! His voice was full of disbelief, and something else too. Relief. Longing. Things he probably didn't even let himself understand yet. Mr. Cross, she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. He walked straight to her counter, ignoring the confused looks from other customers. You disappeared. I looked for you. Nobody would tell me where you went. Grace's chest tightened. He looked for her. Of course, that didn't matter now. Not with everything at stake, but hearing it still made her heart skip painfully. I got fired, she said simply. For theft. Which I didn't do. His jaw tightened. That's not possible. I never approved that. Vivian did. The name hung in the air between them like a blade. Julian studied her face for a long moment, and Grace realized this was it. This was her chance, maybe her only chance, and she couldn't waste it on fear again. Julian, she said, using his first name for the first time ever, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to trust me, even though I know that's going to be hard. Vivian is not who she says she is. She told him everything, right there in that small coffee shop, her voice shaking but steady, laying out every piece of the puzzle. The photograph, the different name, the dead husband, the man who wasn't really a wedding planner. Julian listened in silence, his face growing paler with every word, his hands curling into fists on the counter. When she finished, there was a long, heavy silence. I need proof, he finally said, his voice hollow. Real proof. Not just a photograph in a newspaper article. If I go to my family, my board, my lawyers with a story like this, and I'm wrong, it will destroy everything I've built. But if I'm right, he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I know, Grace whispered. That's why I've been trying to find more. Julian looked at her for a long time, something shifting behind his eyes. Help me, he said quietly. Help me find the truth. Please. And that is how Grace found herself, days later, sneaking back into the Cross Mansion after midnight, her heart hammering in her chest. Julian waiting nervously by the garden gate as she slipped through a side door she still had a key to, heading straight for Vivian's private suite, hoping against hope that the photograph and whatever else was hidden there was still exactly where she had left it. This is the part of the story where I need you to lean in close, because everything is about to speed up fast. Grace crept down the hallway in the dark, her flashlight covered with her hand to keep the light low. She reached Vivian's room, slipped inside, and went straight for the jewelry box. Her fingers found the false bottom. The photograph was gone. Her heart dropped. Someone had moved it. She searched further, faster now, her hands shaking, and that's when she found something even worse. A folder, hidden inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf, filled with documents. Bank transfer forms. A prenup agreement with strange, hidden clauses buried deep in the legal language. Clauses that would allow Vivian to claim a massive settlement if the marriage ended within the first year, whether by divorce or by something far more permanent. There was also a plane ticket, one way, leaving 3 days after the wedding, under yet another different name. Grace snapped photos of every single page with trembling hands. And then she heard footsteps in the hallway. She froze, flashlight off, heart pounding so loud she was sure it could be heard through the walls. The footsteps grew closer. The door handle turned. Vivian stepped into the room, flipped on the light, and found Grace standing there, folder in hand. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then Vivian smiled, but it was not her sweet, practiced smile. It was cold, sharp, dangerous, like a mask finally slipping off to reveal what had been underneath the entire time. "Well," Vivian said softly, closing the door behind her, "aren't you a clever little maid?" "Stay back," Grace said, backing toward the window. "You have no idea what you've just walked into," Vivian said, taking a slow step forward. "Do you know how many times I've done this? How many careful, patient months I've spent building the perfect story, the perfect woman, just to have some maid ruin it because she can't mind her own business." "Julian doesn't love you," Grace said, her voice shaking but firm. "He never did. He loved the idea of not being alone. And you used that against him." Something flickered in Vivian's eyes, something that almost looked like anger at being seen so clearly. "And what do you love, Grace?" Vivian asked, tilting her head. "Do you think a man like Julian Cross could ever love someone like you? A maid? Please. The moment this is over, whether it's with me or with someone else, he will forget your name within a year." The words hit harder than Grace expected, striking right at the fear she had buried deep inside herself since the very first night she made him that cup of warm milk. But she refused to let it show. "Maybe you're right," Grace said. "But at least I never had to lie about who I am to make someone care about me." Vivian's face twisted, and in one sudden motion, she lunged forward, grabbing for the folder in Grace's hands. They struggled, the folder tearing between them, papers scattering across the floor, and in the chaos, Grace's phone slipped from her pocket and clattered against the ground, the flashlight app still on, illuminating everything in a sudden, sharp light. That's when the bedroom door burst open, and Julian stood there, having heard the noise from downstairs, his eyes moving from Vivian to Grace, to the scattered documents on the floor, to the torn folders still gripped in both of their hands. "What is going on?" His voice was low, dangerous, a voice Grace had never heard him use before. Vivian recovered instantly, her face melting back in a soft, wounded innocence. "Julian, thank God. She broke into my room. She's been stalking me since she got fired. I think she's obsessed with you. She's clearly not well." "Stop." Julian's voice cut through the room like a blade. He bent down, picked up one of the scattered papers from the floor, and read it slowly. His face went pale, then hard, then something that looked almost like heartbreak. "A one-way ticket," he said quietly. 3 days after our wedding. "Julian, I can explain." "Explain the prenup clauses too," he said, his voice shaking now, not with weakness, but with barely controlled fury. "Explain why they're written so that you get everything if I die within the first year." Silence fell over the room like a heavy blanket. Vivian's expression finally cracked, just for a second, just long enough for Julian to see the truth underneath. "And that, my friend, is where we have to pause again, because I promise you, what happens in the next part of this story will absolutely break your heart before it puts it back together. If you're feeling the tension right now, if your chest is tight wondering what's going to happen next, do me a favor and drop a comment right now telling me you're still here. Then let's keep going." For a long moment, nobody moved. Julian stood there holding the paper like it weighed 1,000 pounds, staring at the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, watching every carefully built illusion crumble in front of him. "Say something," he whispered. "Tell me it's not true." Vivian's shoulders dropped. The soft, sweet mask fell away completely, and what was left underneath was tired, calculating, and strangely almost relieved. "You want the truth?" she said quietly. "Fine. The truth is, men like you don't fall in love with women like me, Julian. You fall in love with a performance. I gave you exactly what you wanted. Someone beautiful, someone attentive, someone who never asked you to actually open up because I never really wanted to know you. I just wanted what you had." "Why?" His voice cracked on the single word. "Because I grew up with nothing," Vivian snapped, years of buried anger suddenly spilling out. "I watched my mother clean houses for people just like you, working herself into the ground while rich men threw away more money on a single dinner than she made in a month. So yes, I learned how to become whoever a rich man needed me to be. It's not complicated. It's survival." "You were going to kill me," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was answer enough. Julian turned to Grace then, his eyes filled with something raw and overwhelmed. Gratitude and horror and disbelief all tangled together. "You saved my life," he said quietly. Before Grace could respond, the bedroom door burst open again, and this time it was Detective Bell, along with two uniformed officers, having been called by Grace the moment she confirmed Vivian's identity earlier that night. Vivian didn't even try to run. There was nowhere to go. She was placed in handcuffs right there in the room she had once planned to celebrate her engagement in, her carefully built future collapsing in the space of 10 minutes. As the officers led her away, she looked back one final time, not at Julian, but at Grace. "Enjoy him while it lasts," she said coldly. "Men like Julian always find someone better eventually." Grace didn't answer. She simply watched until Vivian disappeared down the hallway, out of the house, and out of their lives. Silence settled over the bedroom, thick and strange after so much chaos. Julian sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and for the first time since Grace had known him, this powerful, untouchable man who owned buildings and companies and more money than most countries looked simply, achingly human. Broken, exhausted, betrayed. Grace knelt down beside him, uncertain of what to say, uncertain if she even had the right to comfort him after everything. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He looked up at her, his eyes red, his walls, the walls he had spent years building, completely gone. "Why did you come back?" he asked. "You could have just let it happen. You could have moved on with your life. Instead, you risked everything, your job, your safety, to save a man who barely even noticed you were gone until it was too late." "I noticed you," Grace said softly, her voice trembling. "From the very first night, standing in that kitchen at 2 in the morning. I noticed you weren't like the stories people tell about billionaires. You were just a person, tired and lonely, and trying so hard to hold everything together. I couldn't let someone hurt you. Not when I—" She stopped herself, her cheeks flushing red. "Not when you what?" Julian asked quietly, leaning slightly closer. Grace took a shaky breath. "Not when I started caring about you. More than I probably should have. More than a maid is supposed to care about her employer." The room went completely silent, the air between them thick with everything neither of them had ever dared to say out loud. "Grace," Julian said softly, reaching out to gently take her hand, "I have spent months surrounded by a woman pretending to feel something for me. And in 3 weeks of you being gone, I thought about you more than I ever thought about her in 3 months." Grace's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst right out her chest. "I'm just a maid," she whispered, almost like she was trying to remind herself, trying to protect her own heart before it got too far ahead of her. "You're the only person in years who ever made me feel like more than my money," Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. "You made me warm milk at 2 in the morning because you saw a man who couldn't sleep, not a man who owned a company. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Tears filled Grace's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "I was so scared," she admitted. "Scared that if I told you the truth about how I felt, you'd think I was just like her. After something. Trying to trick you too." Julian reached up and gently wiped a tear from her cheek, his touch soft, careful, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. "You are nothing like her," he said firmly. "You are the realest thing that has ever walked into my life." And there, in that quiet bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of a wedding that would never happen. Julian Cross leaned forward and gently pressed his lips to Grace's, soft and slow, and full of everything neither of them had been brave enough to say for months. Grace melted into the kiss. Months of buried feelings finally allowed to breathe, her hands trembling as she rested them against his chest, feeling his heart pound just as hard as her own. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Julian rested his forehead gently against hers. "There's not going to be a wedding today," he said softly. "But I promise you, Grace, one day there's going to be one. And it's not going to be built on lies. It's going to be built on exactly this." Grace laughed through her tears, a sound full of relief and disbelief and overwhelming happiness all mixed together. But before you get too comfortable, because I promise you twists, let's jump forward now to that morning we started this story with. The wedding morning. Because here's the truth I didn't tell you yet. Vivian was released on bail 3 days before what would have been the wedding, her lawyers moving fast, her partner Mr. Davies disappearing completely, evidence mysteriously going missing from a supposedly secure evidence locker. And Vivian, furious, humiliated, and out of options, made one final, desperate move. She showed up at the wedding. Not Julian and Grace's wedding. Months later, quiet and small and full of real love. No, she showed up disguised, sitting quietly among the guests at what everyone believed was a completely different event that same week, a highly publicized charity gala wedding auction that Julian's company had organized for publicity, where Julian, as a joke arranged by his own PR team, stood at a mock altar as part of a charity stunt, raising money by marrying the highest bidder for a single dance, completely unaware that Vivian had bought her way into the crowd, planning one final act of revenge before disappearing forever. That is the wedding Grace burst into. That is the moment the door slammed. That is the cliffhanger you're sitting with right now. So let's finally go back there, together, and see exactly what Grace was trying so desperately to stop. The doors of a church swung shut behind Grace as the guards dragged her outside, her voice still echoing off the stone walls. Inside, Julian stood frozen at the altar, staring at Vivian, who had disguised herself under a heavy veil and a stolen invitation, close enough now to reach into her sleeve. For one horrifying second, sunlight caught the edge of something metal hidden in her hand. A guest screamed. Security lunged forward just as Vivian raised her arm, but Julian, some instinct screaming louder than fear, grabbed her wrist mid-motion, twisting it hard enough that the small blade clattered uselessly to the marble floor. Guards swarmed instantly, pulling her back, ripping the veil away to reveal her face to 500 stunned guests. "You ruined everything," Vivian screamed, thrashing against the officers now rushing in. "I had nothing, and you had everything, and you were never even going to notice me disappearing with it." Julian stood there, breathing hard, staring at the woman who had almost taken his life not once, but twice. "It's over, Vivian," he said quietly. "It was always going to end like this." As officers finally dragged her away for good this time, her threats fading down the church steps and into a waiting police car, Julian turned toward the doors Grace had been pulled through minutes earlier, his heart pounding with something far more urgent than fear. He ran. He pushed through the doors, ignoring the shocked whispers of the crowd behind him, and found Grace standing outside on the church steps, shaking, tears streaming down her face, the guards finally releasing her once they realized the real danger had been inside, not outside. "Grace!" Julian breathed, pulling her into his arms without a single word of hesitation. "You're okay," Grace sobbed into his chest. "You're actually okay. Because of you," Julian said, holding her tightly. "Again, always because of you." He pulled back just enough to look in her eyes, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I told you there would be a real wedding one day," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Built on truth. Built on you." Grace laughed through her tears. "This is not exactly how I imagined stopping a wedding would go." "Marry me," Julian said suddenly, the words falling out of him before he could stop them, raw and unplanned and completely honest. Not some charity stunt, not some performance for cameras. The real thing. You and me. No lies, no secrets, no fear. Just us. Grace stared at him, breathless, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Yes, she whispered. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The crowd of stunned wedding guests, having poured out of the church behind them, erupted into applause and cheers, cameras flashing, strangers crying happy tears at a proposal none of them had expected, but somehow all of them understood. Because sometimes the most real love story isn't the one that looks perfect on paper. It's the one built quietly, patiently, honestly, between two people who saw each other clearly when nobody else bothered to look at all. 1 year later, Julian and Grace stood in that same church, this time with no cameras, no charity stunt, no danger lurking in the crowd. Just family, just real friends. Grace's mother, healthy now thanks to the treatment Julian had quietly paid for months earlier without ever mentioning it, sat in the front row crying happy tears as her daughter walked down the aisle in a simple white dress. No longer a maid, no longer invisible, but a woman who had fought for love and truth and won. Julian stood at the altar waiting for her, and when their eyes met, there was no fear in either of them anymore. No walls, no secrets, just two people who had found each other in the middle of chaos and chosen, again and again, to hold on. And when the priest finally said the words, when Julian leaned down and kissed his new wife in front of everyone who mattered, somewhere far away, in a quiet prison cell, Vivian Marsh sat alone, having lost everything she ever tried to steal, learning far too late the one lesson she never understood. Real love was never something you could fake your way into. It had to be earned. And Grace had earned every single second of hers. If this story made you feel something today, if it made your heart pound or your eyes water, even just a little, that is exactly why I write these. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and let me know in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Thank you for staying until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.